have a flyer on Mr. Rick Revel, actor, artist, author, musician, songwriter. He's done it all. He has a book, if you have checked it out over here, on Mr. Chronicles of Captain Jack Henson. You may have received this flyer in your minutes. There's no need for me to read this to you if you already have it, and we'll turn the program over to Mr. Revel.
Thank you. Good to be here. Kind of one of those interesting events to come and speak. And last night, some of you were there. This afternoon, some of you were Rotary. So, did something last night though. It was kind of fun. Had a chance last night to do first person. The book is actually written through the eyes of J.D. Musgrave, and I did a first person last night of J.D. Musgrave. That was a lot of fun to do that. Tonight we're just going to kind of approach it more from a standard standpoint, kind of give you an idea of some of the things that I've encountered with Tom McKinney. How many of you has a copy of Tom's book, Jack Henson's One Man War? So you're very familiar with it, so don't want to rehash and go over the Jack Henson story that much in terms of what you already know. We're going to try to get into things you might not know. I actually got 2 books from Tom. The first book was A Sacrifice. I was in a movie down in Atlanta, and I told Tom I was going to be part of this movie, and I had gotten to know the producer and director real well. And I had the copy of the book with me, and it was in a movie called Walk in the Woods with Robert Redford, and there's a scene in there where there's supposed to be a reenactment taking place in the woods. And I was the reenacting coordinator for it. And as movie making goes, things sometimes don't go as well as it should. In our particular scene, the way it was set up, we were supposed to be out in the woods carrying on a reenactment, and I coordinated everything, got all the reenactors lined up for it. And so you were supposed to be in the woods. In the movie, the order was, as Nick Nolte and Robert Redford walked through the woods, they happened on to reenactors. After that, they wind up in a restaurant somewhere, and there's all the reenactors. And the joke is, during the first scene, all the reenactors are fighting one another, Yankees against Confederates. In the restaurant, they're all sitting together having lunch together. That was the joke. Well, guess what? Scene 1 gets cut, and there's no reenactment scene at all in the movie. And so here we're all sitting in a restaurant, and the scene is, there's the Union colonel sitting there, and then there's me, and there's Nick Nolte, and there's Robert Redford. And it's like, everybody's going, oh, there's you, but why are you there? You're in a Confederate uniform. What's that got to do with anything? So it kind of looks dumb. But such is Hollywood. But I got to be in a movie with Robert Redford, so that was kind of fun. But long story short, I wound up giving that book to the producer. And Ken Quampus was his name. What a name. But he was very nice to me. If you've ever seen the television series The Office, he was been one of the producers of The Office. But he did that particular movie, and I gave him a copy, my copy of the book that I'd received as a gift. And it started all this, and so I sacrificed my book to try to get a movie made of it, because I was still trying to pursue that, and I'd written a script about Tom's book. So Tom wound up giving me another book, and he said, for my friend Rick Revel, composer and performer of the Ballad of Captain Jack, thanks for keeping a good story alive, Tom McKinney. And this book is the second book. That first book is the one that kind of got everything started for me. A friend of mine gave it to me, a reenacting friend gave me a copy of the book, and I fell in love with it instantly, read it through once, twice, and a third time. And we were in the studio working on a new album, and I needed a new song, another song to add to the album. And one night we got in, I got into the house, and this particular melody, this little riff on the guitar, little banjo type of riff, started working on it, and before long the lyrics began to flow. And a few minutes later, we had the song written. And then the following night, we went in the studio, recorded it. And then we wound up not far from here when we did the 150th reenactment battle of Fort Donelson. And it was out where the meteor struck the ground, and near the industrial park out there. And we did the reenactment at that location. Tom McKinney was there for a book signing, and that was my first time to meet him. And played him this song, and once I played the song, he said, well, can I take this song and promote my book with it? And he wanted to take a CD with him and play it on the road. And I said, well, you can take the song with you, but I go with it. So he started taking me around, and we would do some promotions together. I'll play you the song real quick, called The Ballad of Captain Jack. Fort Henry and Donelson both came on the sea. Ulysses, his friend, would make the South clean, and Jack Henson's family would be home in the fray. And from that day on, there'd be hell to pay. Jack's two young boys went hunting after dawn, shooting at some squirrels, then things went all wrong. A Yankee patrol, just a man shot and dead. They took on back to Jack, and he cut off their heads. There's a one-man war being waged in Tennessee. Vengeance of an angry father brought the Yankees to their knees. One by one they would fall and never come back. Shot down by the man we all knew as Captain Jack. He had a special made rifle for the task he had, and he would lay in wait until they saw his man. Here half a mile away, he'd line up his sights. There'd be one less Yankee I'd roll all night. On the Tennessee River, his wrath would rain down, and every Yankee captain here they would run around. Brass buttons on the coat as girl Jack would aim. Another notch on his gun, another Yankee was slain. There's a one-man war being waged in Tennessee. The vengeance of an angry father brought the Yankees to their knees. One by one they would fall and never come back. Shot down by the man we all knew as Captain Jack. At least 100 would fall before the war's end. Every time he pulled the trigger, he saw the faces of the men that killed his young sons and left their heads on the floor. That's why Captain Jack's story must be told. There's a one-man war being waged in Tennessee. The vengeance of an angry father brought the Yankees to their knees. One by one they would fall and never come back. Shot down by the man we all knew as Captain Jack. Shot down by the man we all knew as Captain Jack. That's the song that started it all. He wanted to take it on the road with him, like I said. While we were traveling, of course the book, a lot of people instantly when they read the book, said, that'd make a great movie. And I did the same thing. I said, Tom, your book would make an excellent movie. And he said, you know anybody that can write a script? And I dabbled in it also before, doing some script writing. So he gave me that challenge. So I went ahead and put together a script. And he was coming back through on another book signing tour, and I went out with him and showed him the script. And he began to chuckle, just the same way he did when he first heard the song, sitting over here at the meteor crater area. He just started chuckling about the song. He did the same thing about the script. He liked the dialogue, the verbiage, how the people were talking to one another. See, in his book, it's a biography, and it's going straight for the facts. It's trying to tell you the story from a factual standpoint. And in the movie script, I was following his chronological facts and the timeline that he set up. But when you watch a movie, they talk to one another, don't they? And so I had dialogue. And he began to read that, and he said, could you take that and convert that into a historic fiction novel? When he first said it, I went, why? He said, you have brought a whole new vision of what Henson was like. You've taken what I've done and you've added to it. Because even some of the facts that he has in his book, I was able to take more research on top of what he had found and added to it. For example, in the book he talks about the 5th Iowa Cavalry. He talks about, which is an ironic thing, the 5th Iowa Cavalry, here's you a funny one, 5th Iowa Cavalry doesn't have anybody from Iowa in it. They're all from Minnesota, Missouri, and Kansas. One member from New York. None from Iowa. 5th Iowa Cavalry. Nobody from Iowa. The group that killed the boys, who were they? How do you find that out? As researchers, this is the fun part of it. When you get to digging and peeling those layers of the onion back. Go to the muster records. A lot of the muster records will tell you the fate of the soldiers. If they survived the war and they mustered out in 65, or the Minnesota part of the 5th Iowa Cavalry, they wind up going out west and fighting in the Indian Wars after the Civil War. But in Tom's book, he talks about March, April, and May of 63. After he gets his special-made gun, special-made rifle put together, he goes out on the killing spree. And if you look in the muster records, under the Irish Dragoons, called Knowlton's Irish Dragoons, you begin finding men that were killed on certain dates during those months. And next to their names it says, killed by guerrilla. Not killed in action, not killed in a skirmish, killed by guerrilla. And it's in that same time frame. And there's nobody else in any other unit in the 5th Iowa Cavalry that's a casualty during that period except in the Irish Dragoons. Which led me to believe these are the culprits. These are the ones that killed Henson's sons. So after finding little simple things like that, that got him even more excited, and him to really encourage me to do the historic fiction novel. Kind of the downside of the historic fiction novel, you had two words in the same phrase that are just opposites. Historic and fiction. That's just about as opposite as you can get. The fiction part is the dialogue. The history part is a chronological timeline. The timeline that Tom established as well is 29 to 30 other references, historic references, including the official record by the Union and Confederate officers. Colonel William Lowe talks about the Hensons. He calls them Henson's Horse Cavalry as well as the Shotgun Cavalry. But he is referring to Robert Henson, who was from Humphreys County at the time, the oldest son of Jack. Tom talks about Robert quite a bit. Give you a few fun things. I promised some of you that's heard me twice already, at least once. that I'd throw a few other tidbits in there. Robert was an interesting individual. Robert Henson got himself captured 3 times. Second time he was captured, now the first time he was captured, which also proves something and unravels some local history, a lot of the people think that the courthouse in Stewart County was burned in August of '62. But in further research, and I also have a local historian there that agrees with me, when she did some of the research, she found that the 83rd Illinois said that they burnt, which that was an infantry group that eventually became a mounted infantry group. Virgil Earp was part of that, Wyatt Earp's brother. They talk about in the summer of '63 burning the courthouse, which makes the story work much better that Tom tells, because Tom talks about possibly May of '63, Robert's captured and he jumps out of the 2nd-story window of the courthouse. How could he jump out of a courthouse that's been burnt? It's no longer there. How could he do that? But when you dig and you find in the summer of '63, the 83rd Illinois taking credit for it, that's how you start piecing the puzzles back together. Robert was captured and he's sent to Nashville, Tennessee. Tom talks about that in his book. But when I told him where Robert was taken, it blew his mind. It blew Tom's mind. It's going to blow yours. How many's ever heard of the Maxwell House Hotel? Good to the last drop. Yeah. It wasn't finished yet when the war began. It became a prison. The Union Army confiscated it, and those that were captured were sent there by some of the local provost marshals. When Tom said he was sent to Nashville, the only place he could have been sent to was the Maxwell House Hotel. And Jack went to bust him out. But you don't get to read about that until later. This is a trilogy, so it's it'll be a follow-up book comes down the road. But I wanted to at least throw that little curveball to you because Maxwell House Hotel, everybody's heard of that. But a lesser amount of people know it was actually a prison at one time. And guess what? After Robert was rescued, not too long after that, after the Battle of Chickamauga, it was cram-packed with Confederate soldiers, just crammed. Morning mess call, Confederates supposedly were upstairs, had to go downstairs for breakfast. As they're going down the stairwell collapsed. And as the story goes, it killed between 300 and 400 Confederates, prisoners. So, but you can find it. It's in local history there. Look it up. Get the rest of the story. It's kind of cool reading about what happened at the Maxwell House Hotel. And that's the little nuggets. If you keep digging and keep digging, you take things that Tom provided and you dig deeper and try to expand on the story. So that's what we did with book 1. We tried to expand on the story, and we just do 1862. So I'm talking about what took place only in '62, which is through the death of the boys, and goes through the beginning of the building of the gun. Book 2 is when we pick up when the revenge starts. Book 1, though, it takes you some interesting times. It takes you through some vivid detail of the Battle of Fort Donelson. It takes you through some things that actually happened with Forrest and Colonel Hanson with the Orphan Brigade and the breakout of February 15th. So some of the things that took place then, it's going to take you on some detail that you're unaware of, that Jack had an opportunity to witness. Because another thing that's kind of cool that I found in the local records there, through John Mitchell's business directory, which also has your communities named. Of course, it wasn't Houston County then, but your communities were named that existed during that period. But the John Mitchell business directory, published in 1860 in Dover, Tennessee, listed Henson's grocer shop. And then when I looked at the local records of property that he owned lots 50 and 51, one being vacant, but one having structures. If you go to Dover today, there sits Taco John. And that's where lot 50 and 51 is located. It's in that location. So it's kind of cool to find some of these things. So Jack, what was his reason? And see, Tom left you with so many questions in his book. He said he met Grant, he met Forrest, he met Pillow. He got to know Pillow well enough that there was an inquiry. There's documented proof in the back where Jack has to go and give a testimony about the fall of Fort Donelson, a civilian giving a testimony. How did he get to know these people? Why was he important enough to have to go give his version of what took place at the fall of Fort Donelson? And Pillow is the one that requested it. He requested Jack to go give a testimony. As I kept digging, it's a rag to riches story. When Jack first moved there in his 20s to Stewart County, he was poor. But he began to work his way up immediately. He became a timber cutter. That's what my family's heritage. We were farmers and timber cutters. So I can relate. Hot, nasty work this time of year. And you think, well, you're under the shade of trees. It's humid in there too. And you're also cutting away your shade. So you lose your shade, and then the humidity when you cut a tree, it shoots up, buddy. So it gets hot and very sultry in the woods this time of year. Jack was cutting timber, and he was making the wood billets that was turned into charcoal for the furnaces. And that's where he got to know Senator John Bell. Senator John Bell was a resident of Stewart County, which is also overlooked. He has a residence there called Bellwood Plantations. It still stands. It is privately owned. We're trying to get the local owner. I'm working with Robin Brandon, the county mayor, seeing if we can somehow get the house preserved through the historical registry. We've got some people at the state level that's trying to help us get some funding for it. But it's abandoned. There's nobody living in it. I know the lady that owns it, and it's been vandalized several times. And if we don't get it in the historical registry before afraid it's going to get vandalized and burned. So if we can get it protected somehow. But this house still stands right next to the Bellwood furnace, which, if you look in some of his memoirs, he talks about being able to sit on the front porch of his home, looking down the hill, and being able to see the Bellwood furnace. And there it sits this very day. You can see the Bellwood furnace right from the front porch of the home. So it still stands. The Bellwood furnace still stands partially. The Union gunboats, after the fall of Fort Donelson, they go down the river and they blow up the furnace. And they completely destroy the Cumberland Iron Works. And that's who Jack was selling the billets to help make the charcoal, was to Senator John Bell's furnaces. And they eventually became business partners in the Swan Tract. Tom mentions that in his book. The Swan Tract land, they become partners, which is 400 acres of land to supply the ore for furnaces at Cumberland Iron Works. And so Jack was friends with him. He began to make money from that, began to buy property, received a grant, got another 400 acres before long. He has 1,200 acres. Although cotton was king, I find in the 1860 farm census, it was not so in Stewart County. Corn was king in Stewart County, and tobacco right behind it. Another crop that was raised quite a bit in the area, I found quite interesting, which almost completely and totally vanished, but it's now in the news all the time, hemp. It's back in the news now, and it's back from being raised again. But back then, it was not for medicinal purposes so much as to make rope. It was to be used for its fiber. So hemp I found quite predominant on his farm. He had milch cows. What we call milk cows today. I thought it was funny how they spelt it. Milch cows and beef cattle. He had about 35, 36 head of beef cattle, and oxen, mule, horses. The horses were mainly to ride, mules, oxen to do the labor around the farm. Became quite a wealthy individual, so the Henson Grocery Shop was an offshoot of his farming operation. It was to take his produce, and he raised potatoes and sweet potatoes also, Irish potatoes and sweet potatoes. That was one that I found was interesting, one of his big crops. And so he was taking these things and stocking his grocery shop with it. Raised hogs, had his own smokehouse, did his own hams. When you pulled into Bubbling Springs, it was a self-contained city within itself. I mean, everything was there. He had his own blacksmith shop. Everything could be done there. And his own sovereign mill. He could do it all there. So it was quite interesting. Some think that some of the local historians feel he probably lived in a log structure. Tom, and I agree with Tom on this, he said that he lived in a plantation-style home, 4 rooms down, 4 rooms up. Jack had 10 children. But if you also study, there's a lot of families lived out of a 2-room dog trot with the upstairs for the kids. So I get that. And a lot of them had a lot of kids that were living in that size home. But Jack also opened his home up as a stagecoach stop, like we call a bed and breakfast today. He was an inn and tavern then. He had his tippler license, as well as 2 of his sons had the tippler license, which meant he could serve liquor from his home. But he could also do it from his grocery shop. So his plans were to eventually attach a tavern to his grocery store. War begins, and a lot of his entrepreneurial plans are overshadowed. But he's very enterprising. He had a bumper crop the year before, the fall before, as did a lot of the other farmers. And you'll read about it in chapter 1. He begins to organize this very vivid idea about how to gather all the crops together, because there they are. All these Confederates are marching in and they're hungry. They got to be fed. So Jack says, I don't have enough in my grocery shop, but I know where I can get it. So he goes to his neighbors and he begins to organize things and gets food. And Pillow is one of the individuals he has to deal with. So that's one of the ways he became friends with Pillow. So much so, he winds up having to give a testimony years later, or within a year later, in 63. The thing that Tom talked about in his book, he talked about Jack meeting Grant at the Widow Crisp home. I found that very interesting. Of course, when I first read Tom's book, he said that in the book that he met Grant at the Widow Crisp home. She wasn't a widow yet. So why did they call it the Widow Crisp home? And if you go to Fort Donelson today, what do they call it? The Widow Crisp home. They do. Look at some of the brochures, even in some of the history books. National Park Service promotes Widow Crisp home. Local lore from the Crisp family. John Crisp was one of the providers of the food for the Confederate Army, just like Jack and some of the other neighbors. As was the Williams family in their family records, talk about having a barge full of corn when the Union Army comes down the Cumberland River. And why the Union Army did it, I don't know, but they burnt the barge of corn. Why didn't they just take it and consume it? Feed it to the horses, but they burned it. Made no logic to me. They'd burn your barn, burn your house. They would arrest you and send you off to prison. Or they might just kill you. They did that too. But they burned out several families while they were preparing to place the siege on Fort Donelson. Jack was worried about his store. He had already pulled his sons home, and he wanted to go check on his store. And if you ride up Henson Lane, which is now Kill Hollow Road, which comes out by the Dollar General store, when you come out there, you just dogleg around and you're on. The Crisp Farm is right there. The main Lake Highway or Tennessee River Highway, Paris Landing Highway, what are you going to call it now? It parallels with the Crisp farmland. As the Crisp family says, John Crisp had been selling food. He was the news had been filtering down that farms were being burned and men were being imprisoned and possibly hung to be a traitor, and he didn't want that to happen. So Martha talks about him swimming the river or the Hickman Creek. You have to keep in mind, you think we'll swim in the creek. It's no big deal because it wasn't that deep of a creek, but it's a big creek. Go look at it. It's pretty deep. Deep enough you can put a pretty good sized pontoon boat on it, on the backwater. During that week, it was in the 60s, in the 70s. It was very hot. So hot, the Union soldiers, when they're marching from Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, they're throwing down their knapsacks and their greatcoats and their wool blankets along the side of the road. Too hot. And they're hoping that the wagon train behind them will pick them up. Dumb. Very dumb. It would cost several lives for that dumb move. Because several of those soldiers that threw down their knapsacks, blankets, and greatcoats froze to death. Because it dropped down to 16 degrees on the 13th. And snowed. Confederates and Union soldiers were freezing in their positions, sleeping on the ground. Confederates slept on the ground, most of them. There were huts up in the fort, shanties as they were called, but that was for the garrison. The new soldiers coming in, some had tents, some didn't. Some of the newest arrivals did not even have tents and were sleeping in the trenches. So a lot of the Confederates were sleeping on a blanket in the trenches when it's snowing. The Union soldiers had marched in, thrown away all their protection, and they're sleeping on the ground and they're freezing to death. That night when John Chris swam the creek, it's 16 degrees. He catches pneumonia. Within 2 to 3 weeks later, he is dead. But she was yet to be a widow. So why did they call it the Widow Crispon? Well, let's jump now to Ulysses S. Grant memoirs. He said, and he's looking from the prime territory to put his headquarters. And if you've ever go to where the Crisp home used to sit, it's no longer there. Big placards there. But when you get there in the wintertime when there's no foliage on the trees, you know why they picked that spot. Because you can actually see the fort from the house, or where the house used to sit. You can actually see the fort. So Grant picked out that spot so he could watch the movement in the fort from the Crisp home. When he arrives, as he talks about it, he said that he's in the house with Martha Crisp and the 2 boys. There were 2 sons. He says that John Crisp comes to the door, sees him and his officers inside the house, turns tails and runs, and they never see or hear from him again. If that really happened, why do they call it the Widow Crisp home? Because he saw the husband. To this day, why do they call it that? I don't know. But they call it the Widow Crisp home. But you find all these little nuggets. And why did Jack go there? Well, he's trying to get to his store. And as he goes by to check on the Crisp family, this is when he finds out that John's gone. And he feels quite guilty. He doesn't expect to find Grant there. Now, a lot of people say, how did he meet Forrest? Almost the same way. Forrest rides up while Jack is providing food. Forrest is one of those he was a very independent individual. Used some of his own money. Matter of fact, just about all of his money was spent on his soldiers. They had just gotten back from Louisville. They had gotten Colt revolvers, sabers, and Maynard rifles. Coming back down from Louisville, they had their first battle at Sacramento, Kentucky. Come back through Bowling Green. Received orders from Sidney Johnson to go to Fort Donelson. On their arrival to Fort Donelson, they have to have food. And who do they go to? The #1 food supplier, Jack Henson. So that's how Forrest and Henson meet. The challenge you'll read about, quite interesting. How did Jack get his reputation so well established to begin with as being a well-known marksman? It was through turkey shoots. So his reputation was well established way before the war as being a great shot. Even Senator John Bell compared him to Colonel David Crockett, or Davy Crockett as we call him. Said he was one of the best shots in the state of Tennessee. And since Crockett was dead now, he said he was probably the best shot in the state of Tennessee. That's pretty good, because I've studied Crockett. That boy could shoot. Comparatively speaking, Judge McFarland was talking about 600 yards and long shots, 500, 600 yards. At the Alamo, Crockett was shooting 500 to 600 yards, taking out the crew members of a Mexican artillery piece. Jack's doing that on a steamboat down the Tennessee River. I would say they're pretty close to being equal, wouldn't you? Both using rifles without telescopes, with fixed sights. Don't know that Crockett ever used spectacles, but the Memphis Daily Appeal talks about Captain Jack Henson being the bespectacled Captain Jack Henson, is what they called him. And they had an incident where they actually talked about him being a sharpshooter and taking out marksman and taking out some of the sharpshooters there at Fort Donelson, which that particular set of sharpshooters would have been Burgess sharpshooters, shooting Demick rifles. And a Demick rifle resembles a plainsman rifle or a Hawkins rifle a little bit, specially designed strictly for those marksmen or the sharpshooters, or the Burgess sharpshooters, which is kind of ironic. They call them Burgess sharpshooters and not shooting sharps. And that's where the term comes from. They were shooting Demick rifles. If you know John Walsh that has Fort Donelson relics, he has a Demick rifle. It's pretty cool to see that. Very rare, hardly any left anymore. Jack goes there and he meets Grant. He's met Forrest. He winds up getting trapped in Fort Donelson. He can't get out. So that's where that portrait comes from. I've done 25 different pieces of artwork for the book. I used to do t-shirts for Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and all the national parks. And I took the graphic art method, technique, whatever you want to call it, and that's how I create my art. So I have 25 pieces in there. There's about 7 or 8 pieces of artwork in there from Andy Thomas. He did all the artwork for Fort Donelson. So if you see all the plaques sitting around Fort Donelson, that's Andy Thomas's work. And his work, he allowed me to place it into the book. So the rest of the book has tons of photographs, Library of Congress photographs of Senator John Bell's and different individuals. So there's about 100 illustrations in the book. Most novels don't have that. In the back you'll find 30 historical references. Most novels don't have that. Had one gentleman, he's fussing at me, he said, well, you know, I don't like those historic fiction novels. They're just hogwash. You know, why could you just write a history book? I said, well, what's some of your favorite history books? What are some of the favorite books you ever read? And he gave me a little short list, and one of them he mentioned was Killer Angels, and he liked Gods and Generals. I said, well, you do know that those are historic fiction novels. And no, that's the story of Gettysburg. Yeah, story of Gettysburg, but Michael Shahara wrote it, and there's actually an award today, the Michael Shahara Award for historical fiction novels, because it has the dialogue. He wrote dialogue between his characters, which is the fiction, like in my book. So when you read the book, you're going to learn some things about history that's going to trip your trigger. You're going to, I didn't know that. If I can take and feed things to Tom, because he fed me the information and said dig deeper, and I dug deeper. So if I can get him excited, I'll get you excited as you read the book. So if you've read Tom's, you're going to find some other things in there. And I elaborate. He talks about the slaves. What happened to the slaves? He freed his slaves. Why? How? What was the process? You're going to find out a lot of things about what happened to the boys. Why did they wind up getting sent off to prison? What prison were they sent to? When I told Tom, that blew his mind. Where were civilians sent? All the soldiers were sent to Camp Douglas. Where were the civilians sent? They were sent to Myrtle Street. 3 different locations in St. Louis. First place they landed was called Blood Island. That was the holding tank. The place where they held everybody. You know what Blood Island, where it got its name? Interesting. Sit right in the middle of the Mississippi River. Today you go up there and I think there's, where the big bridge crosses, they got the pillars on it. Blood Island got its name because it sit in a neutral area between the state of Illinois and Missouri. And men would go there to fight duels with the dueling pistols. With it being a neutral area, they could go there and not worry about the law. And guess who was one of the people that's supposed to go there for a duel? Abraham Lincoln. That was an interesting nugget to find. But he and the guy chickened out. Darn it. But anyhow, we won't go there either. The place they went was called Myrtle Street. It was actually called the Slave Pen also. It was a place where, when they had slave auctions, it's called the Slave Pen. It was on Myrtle Street. They eventually called it just the Myrtle Street Prison. The cistern where they got their water was molded, so the water was soured. So when they got water to drink, it immediately affected their stomachs. And they constantly, well, you know how that goes. It's like going to Mexico and drinking the water. You just was sick all the time. Bread and water was their main meal. And we hear about Andersonville and how terrible the Confederates were to the Union soldiers down there. Well, the Union soldiers in Andersonville were getting the same food the Confederate guards were getting. But in Myrtle Street, the Union guards were eating well. The Confederate prisoners were getting bread and water, just like over at Camp Douglas in Chicago. Some of you heard me tell that story this morning, where Camp Douglas, the man that built the gun, he talks about it. And this is not my words. This is from the documentaries that were on the History Channel about Camp Douglas. The citizens of Chicago, they would come out and look at the Confederates as if it's a circus, as if it's a sideshow. And they would come there dressed up in their finest clothes and their tall hats, and the women with their parasols and their nicest evening dresses, dressing up as if it's a social affair. And they're walking along the catwalks. They built special catwalks on the outside of the fortress walls of Camp Douglas so the locals could look at the pitiful Confederates down there, and they'd throw them bread. Just like you go into a circus and throwing peanuts to the monkeys. Myrtle Street's where the 2 boys were sent. Now, let's jump to, why did Grant go to Jack's home? And when would that happen? Tom talks about it, but when would that have happened? The only time it could have happened is during a 9-day period that Grant was on suspension. Remember General Halleck, or Halleck as you want to say it, however you want to pronounce it. He had it in for Grant. He just didn't like the man at all. Grant had done a good job at kind of tarnishing his reputation anyway when he was in the Mexican War. He did some things that they just didn't like. But he supposedly had cleaned his act up. The drinking had supposedly gone away, and he was in sobriety, supposedly, beginning of the war. But nobody wanted to believe that. So it is said that he was out in the middle of the Cumberland River sleeping off a drunk when the Battle of Fort Donelson takes place. So the truth is, he was actually in a conference or talking about battle details with Admiral Foote, who had been wounded and was convalescent, so he was talking to Admiral Foote. So Grant winds up being suspended, supposedly, on charges of being drunk. And during that 9-day period, would be the time that he would visit Jack and stay at his home. And during that time, Jack will say, hey, my sons are in prison, can you get them out? And Grant sends a telegram to get him out. And I think later in the war, after the war is over, and Jack needs somebody to come to his aid because he's still a wanted man after the war. Still researching it, but I'm pretty sure Grant come to his aid also later, but I'm still digging deep on that one. So that gives you some idea that he's got a fun story. It's not your atypical soldier story. This is a civilian that tried to remain neutral. He's a man that winds up becoming, well, when his boys were killed, you know the story, they were beheaded. And once they were beheaded, that's what got, Jack's neutrality, it vanished. Yours would. Somebody harms your children, the mama bear and the women comes out, boy. And the men, my goodness, hurt my daughters, and there's no law to see, there was martial law. There was no police force to help you. They were rendered helpless. The sheriff, Big Ed Bogart, Stewart County, he just quits being a sheriff. He says, there's no use. He says, I do the arrest, they turn them loose. There's nothing I can do. So Ed Bogart, he just went back to his tobacco farm. It's in the Stewart County records. He quit being sheriff because of it. So, as you read the book, you'll find out a lot of fun little nuggets in it. But I will kind of stop here and let y'all kind of ask some questions and stuff. And we'll do that and then wind her down. Anybody got any questions about Jack Henson, the things that's kind of been in the back of your mind about?
I got one.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your opinion, where's Jack Henson buried?
I think he's buried in your county. I think he's buried closer to home, and here's my theory on it. As much as I loved Danny Riggs when he was alive, I never argued with him. I even did a ceremony there in that graveyard because I respected him, because he did a lot to keep Jack's name alive. But here's my problem with the situation. Not modern day, we're talking about horse and buggy, wagon days. Elizabeth is still alive. Why would a woman bury her husband that many miles away? If you were going to do it, why not bury him at the old Bubbling Springs home place where they had a Henson cemetery? Why in another cemetery? Even further north, northeast, whatever it is. I can't figure it out right now. But why that many miles from Magnolia? That's a long way from Magnolia, where they had settled. So I think Jack's going to be buried a lot closer to home, and a lot closer to where you live. That's my opinion.
Have you ever been down to the Magnolia home site?
No.
One of our historians said that there was a gristmill stone down there that belonged to him. At his gristmill?
It's definitely in all the records. There's even, in back of Tom's book, it's even got the records where he's actually got bills of sales of what he sold to people. So yeah, there's plenty of business records that he had the mill and he was selling cornmeal to local residents in the area. So, but I'd love to go to see that. Yes.
The gentleman that took me to the graveside, he took me to where he thinks that the mill was.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So yeah. So
fall
put that on my bucket list if you don't mind. I'd love to, if you got the time.
When the snakes are gone, we'll...
Good. All right. I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm game. But yeah, that's my belief. I just think it's here. But I'm wrong about a lot of stuff. But just common sense is how I do my research. I know that's how y'all do your research. You just kind of follow the common sense rule. Every now and then you'll find something that just blows common sense out of the water. Like, why did they do that? But I just can't picture him being buried that many miles from home. Not with a living wife. And she does live on a little bit longer. I just don't think she would allow that to happen. Her daddy said, don't you marry Jack Henson. He's a drunk. He's a rough rascal. He's a rounder. That's what they called him. He's a rounder. Don't marry him. Moth to a flame, she married him. You know, Daddy should have never told her that. I mean, she just ran right to it and married him. Pretty young lady. Talked about the cave some. Cave is a beautiful landmark, but guess who lived within 2 miles of the cave? Jack's sister. We talked about that some last night and maybe touched on it just today at noon. He was a Mason. I don't think he lived in the cave like Tom felt he did. I think he was there. I think he made some mighty fine shots from that ridge, from that bluff. But common sense, what does that tell you? You kill somebody from that bluff, they're going to come looking for you. And you better have someplace else to go. He had a sister within 2 miles of there. He also had Seth Outlaw at Danville. Seth Outlaw owned Danville. It was his property. Even they were friends. Very convenient. And that's kind of ironic. The Outlaw Hotel, the Outlaw Saloon. You know, didn't have to change the name. Just they were all outlaws, but they were good outlaws. You know, Seth Outlaw was a riot. Him and his brother, they were entrepreneurs. They took, you know, when the railroad came across the river, how smart was that? To build Danville like he did. That's pretty smart. And it became a thriving community. Basically until TVA ruined it. Am I not right? It was pretty thriving till then, wasn't it? I mean, it was pretty much thriving. So this Seth Outlaw, I'm a fan of his. He was like, wow, that old man, he was smart. He was an elder man when he started his project, so yeah. But I think Jack had his network of friends. It was those friends that hit him out. So the cave, yes, it was a principal part. But did he spend a lot of time there? No. Could. I think he frequented the area, and then he would leave.
Have you ever been there?
Yes and no. I've been to the base, but boy, Terry just don't want you in it right now. Terry Sykes, a friend of mine that has it now, and it's like, no, I'll respect it, and I'll stay away.
He owns a house on top of it.
And that's an aunt. I think that's an aunt or something.
But the signage rock is right down below the house.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's an aunt or something to him, or to
Signature
his wife or something.
line.
But he said in the wintertime I can go up there. So he promised me this winter he'll take me up there. So I'm hoping to get to do that. It's an insurance thing and the rattlesnake thing, so we just don't want anybody injured going there. So I respect that. I respect it. So. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, there are some
Yes.
that do not believe that Jack's sons were beheaded and that he was put on the
Right.
gate. So what documentation is there?
I asked Tom the same thing. He felt it was, where he got his information was through family lore. He went through that a whole lot, collecting family lore. Even the part about the jumping out of the second story of the courthouse, he said a lot of that came from family lore, family letters, family interviews that he would do with different surviving relatives. So that's where he got a lot of his information. So when I'm following what he put in there, that's what I'm basing it on, his biography. So if somebody's disallowing it and saying it didn't ever happen, then that'll be their opinion. You know, everybody's allowed to their own opinion. Boy, there's a lot of people that do adhere to that because in even the local historians that kind of doubt it, it talks about that in some of the newspaper articles about what happened. It also talks about it, Captain Porter talks about Jack Henson coming to the rescue of his battery at Fort Donelson, which confirmed the Memphis Daily Appeal article that talks about the bespectacled Jack Henson killing several Union sharpshooters. So, depends on what you read, I guess. And I try to read as much as I can on it. Tom, actually, ironically, he kind of dismissed the Memphis Daily Appeal article. It was repeated in several other, in the Alabama newspaper and several other Southern friendly newspapers. Because a lot of times they would do it, what we might call propaganda, or something that was to bolster Southern sympathies or to rally the troops and rally the citizens. But when you got Captain Porter talking about it also in 1906 in a book that's published in Ridley Scott's book and some of his other papers, and then you get Major Anderson at the time, which is a aide-de-camp of Bateman, Nathan Bedford Forrest, saying similar type of things about Jack Henson, and you begin to put the credence into it. Did it happen? I cannot be 100% sure that it happened. But based on Tom's book, I feel most likely it did. But some of this would be hard to ever know. And the numbers, how many men were killed? There's 36 kill dots on there, and then there's three notches right above the front sight, which makes a total of 39. But all the research I find, the rascal didn't stop there, because they didn't stop. They kept coming after him. Tom feels it's well over 100, and as the numbers keep tallying, I think he killed probably, between bounty hunters and the privates and non-coms coming after him, close to 100 of those, and then the 36 were probably commissioned officers. And then the 3 hash marks up by the site, Judge McFarland feels that those are probably 3 of the men that beheaded the boys. That's what Judge McFarland feels. And Judge McFarland has traveled with Tom quite a bit too. So he buys the story of the beheading and all that. And Tom revealed to me, actually, the boys were taken back to the courthouse and hung upside down. Their beheaded bodies were hung upside down from an oak tree at the courthouse. It was a gruesome thing, but they were trying to make an example of the boys. So it was pretty gruesome. But what did they do? They made Jack an enemy. And they woke up a giant. They woke up the bear. They poked the bear, and they paid the price. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you.